Aloha. Aloha. It is your boy here to read. Um, yeah. Chapter 8. Tom's mind was made up. He was a forsaken, friendless boy. Nobody loved him. When they found out they had driven him to what they had driven him to, perhaps they would be sorry. He had tried to do right, and get along, but they would not let him. Wait. He was a forsaken, friendless boy. Nobody loved him. When they found out that they had driven what they had driven him to, perhaps they would be sorry. He had tried to do right, and get along, but that would not, but they would not let him. Yes, they had forced him to it at last. He would run away, become a pirate, and lead a life of crime. By this time, he was far down Meadow Lane, and the bell for school to take up tinkled faintly upon his ear. He sobbed. Now to think he should never, never hear that old familiar sound any more, since he was driven out into the cold world. He must submit, but he forgave them. Then the sobs came thick and fast. Just at this point, he met his soul's sworn comrade, Joe Harper. Tom, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, began to blubber out something about a resolution to escape from hard usage and lack of sympathy at home by roaming abroad into the great world, and ended up by hoping that Joe would not forget him. but but it transpired that this was a request that Joe had just been going to make of Tom, and he had come to hunt him up for that purpose. His mother had whipped him for drinking some cream, which he had never tasted and knew nothing about. It was plain that she was tired of him and wished him to go. If she felt that way, there was nothing for him but to succumb. He hoped she would be happy and never regret having driven her poor boy out into the unfeeling world to suffer or die. The two boys walked sorrowingly. As the two boys walked sorrowing along, they made a new compact to stand by each other till death relieved them of their troubles. Then they began to lay plans. Joe was for being a hermit and living on crusts in a remote cave. But after listening to Tom, he conceded that there might be some advantages to a life of crime, and so he consented to being a pirate. Below St. Petersburg, where the Mississippi was a trifle over a mile wide, there's a long, narrow, wooded island with a shallow bar at the head of it. It was not inhabited. It lay close to the further shore, abreast a dense forest. So Jackson's island was chosen. Who were to be the subjects of their piracies was a matter that did not occur to them. They Then they hunted up Huckleberry Finn, and he joined them promptly, for all careers were one to him. They presently separated, to meet at a spot on the river bank, 2 miles above the village, at the favorite hour, midnight. There was a small log raft there, which they meant to capture. Each would bring hooks and lines, and such provisions as he could steal in the most dark and mysterious way, as become outlaws. Before the afternoon was done, they had all managed to enjoy the sweet glory of spreading the fact that pretty soon the town would hear something. All who got this vague hint were cautioned to be mum and wait. About midnight, Tom arrived with a boiled ham and a few trifles, and stopped in a dense undergrowth on a small bluff overlooking the meeting place. It was starlight and very still. The mighty river lay like an ocean at rest. Tom listened a moment. Then he gave a low, distinct whistle. It was answered from under the bluff, and a guarded voice said, "Who goes there?" "Tom Sawyer, the Black Avenger of the Spanish Main. Name your names." Huck Finn, the red-handed, and Joe Harper, the terror of the seas. Tom had furnished these titles from his favorite literature. "'Tis well. Give the countersign." Two hoarse whisperers delivered the same awful world word simultaneously to the brooding night. "Blood." Then Tom let himself down over the bluff, tearing skin and clothes to some extent in the effort. There was an easy, comfortable path along the shore under the bluff, but it lacked the advantages of difficulty and danger so valued by a pirate. The terror of the seas had brought a sight of bacon, and about worn himself with getting it there. Finn the red-handed had stolen a skillet and a quantity of half-cured leaf tobacco, and had brought a few corn cobs to make pipes with, though none of the pirates smoked but himself. The Black Avenger of the Spanish Main said it would never do to start a fire without some fire. It would never do to start without some fire. And that was a wise thought. Matches were hardly known there in that day. They saw fire smouldering upon a great raft 100 yards above, and they went stealthily thither and helped themselves to a chunk. They made an imposing adventure of it, saying "hist" every now and again, and then, and halting with with finger on lip, hands on imaginary dagger hilts, and giving whispered orders that, if the foe stirred, to let him be, to let him have it at the hilt. They knew the raftsmen were all at the village, laying in stores or having a spree, but that was no excuse for conducting this thing in an unpiratical way. They shoved off, presently, Tom in command, Huck at the after oar, and Joe forward. Tom stood gloomy browed, with folded arms, and gave his orders. "Luff and give her the wind." "Aye, aye, sir." "Steady, steady." "Steady is, sir." As the boys were monotonously driving the raft towards midstream, it was understood that these orders were given only for style, and were not intended to mean anything in particular. What's what sail's she carrying?" "Courses, topsail, and flying jib, sir." "Send their y'all up. Lively now." "Aye, sir." And the raft drew beyond the middle of the river. The boys pointed their head right, and lay on their oars to travel with the current. Hardly a word was said during the next hour. Now the raft was passing the distant town. Two or three glimmering lights showed where it lay, peacefully sleeping beyond the vague vast sweep of star-gemmed water. The Black Avenger stood still with folded arms, looking his last upon the scene of his former joys and his later sufferings, and wishing she could see him now, abroad the wild sea, facing peril and death with a grim smile on his lips. It was but a small strain on his imagination to remove Jackson's island beyond eyeshot of the village, so he looked his last, with a broken and satisfied heart. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the raft grounded on the bar above the head of the island, and they waded back and forth until they had landed their freight. Part of the raft's belongings consisted of an old sail, and this they spread over a nook in the bushes for a tent to shelter their provisions. But they themselves would sleep in the open air, and as become outlaws. They built a fire against the side of a great log in the forest, and cooked some bacon in the frying pan for supper. Then used up half of the corn pone stock they had bought. It seemed glorious sport to be feasting in that wild, free way in the virgin forest of an unexplored island, although the climbing fire lit up their faces, and they said they would never return to civilization. When the last crisp slice when the last crisp slice of bacon was gone, they stretched themselves out on the grass, filled with contentment. "Ain't it gay?" said Joe. "It's nuts," said Tom. "What would the boys say if they could see us?" "Say, Well, they just die to be here. Hey, Hucky, I reckon so, said Huckleberry. Anyway, I'm Susan. I don't want nothing better. I don't ever get any enough to eat, generally, and here they can't come and pick at a fella. It's just the life for me, said Tom. You don't have to get up mornings. You don't have to go to school and wash and all that foolishness. You see, a pirate don't have anything, don't have to do anything, Joe. When he's ashore, but hermit, has to be praying considerably. Yes, that's so, said Joe. But I hadn't thought much about it. You know, I'd a good deal rather be a pirate now that I've tried it. And then, said Tom, a hermit's got to sleep on the hottest place he can find, and put up sackcloth and ashes on his head. And what does he put sackcloth and ashes on his head for? Inquired Huck. I don't know. They've got to do it. You'd have to too if you were a hermit. Derned I would, said Huck. I'd run away. He had now finished gouging on the cob, and when he had fitted a weed stem to it, he loaded it with tobacco and pressed a coal into it. As he blew out a fragrant as he blew out a cloud of fragrant smoke, the other pirates envied him this majestic vice, and secretly resolved to acquire it shortly. Presently Huck said, "What does pirates have to do?" Tom said, "Oh, they have a bully time. Take ships and burn them, get the money and bury it, and kill everybody in the ships. Make 'em walk a plank. And they carry the woman to the island," said Joe. "They don't kill the woman." "No," assented Tom. "They don't kill the woman. They're too noble. And the woman's always beautiful, too. And they wear the bulliest clothes, all gold and silver and diamonds." "Diamonds," said Joe. "Who?" said Huck. "Why, the pirates." Gradually, drowsiness began to steal upon him. The pipe dropped from the fingers of the red-handed, and he slept the sleep of the conscious free and weary. The terror of the seas and the black avenger of the Spanish Main had more difficulty in getting to sleep. They said their prayers inwardly, laying down, since there was nobody there to make them kneel and recite aloud. In truth, they had a mind not to say them, but they were afraid lest they call down a special thunderbolt from heaven. Then they hovered upon the verge of sleep, but an intruder came. Now that would not be down. It was conscience. Conscience. They thought of the stolen meat and tried to argue it away by reminding conscience that they had purloined sweetmeats and apples scores of times. But conscience was not to be appeased by such thin plausibilities. It seemed to them, in the end, that there was no getting around the stubborn fact that taking sweetmeats was only hooking, while taking bacon and hams and such valuables was plain stealing, and there was a command against that in the Bible. So they inwardly resolved that their piracies should not again be sullied with the crime of stealing. Then conscience granted a truce, and these curiously inconsistent pirates fell peacefully to sleep. When Tom awoke in the morning, he wondered where he was. He sat up and rubbed his eyes and looked around. Then he comprehended. It was the cool grey dawn, and there was a delicious sense of repose in the deep, pervading silence of the woods. Not a leaf stirred. Beaded dewdrops stood upon the leaves and grasses. A white layer of ashes covered the fire, and a thin blue breath of smoke rose straight in the air. Joe and Huck still slept. Now, far away in the woods, a bird called. Another answered. Presently, the hammering of a woodpecker was heard. Gradually, this cool, dim gray of the morning whitened, as gradually sounds multiplied, and life manifested itself. The marvel of nature, shaking off sleep, unfolded itself to the musing boy. A little green worm came crawling over a dewy leaf, lifting 2/3 of its body into the air from time to time and sniffing around, then proceeding to again, and proceeding again, for he was measuring, Tom said. Now a procession of ants appeared, and from nowhere to in particular, and now a brown spotted ladybug climbed the dizzy height of a grass blade. And Tom bent down close to it and said, "Ladybug, ladybug, fly away home. Your house is on fire. The children's alone." And she took wing and went off to see about it, which did not surprise the boy, for he knew of old that this insect was credulous about conflagra- conflagrations. When long lances of sunlight began to pierce through the foliage, Tom stirred up the other parrots, and in a minute or two they all were stripped and tumbling over each other in the shallow, limpid water of this white sandbar. A vagrant current in the river had carried off their raft, but this only gratified them, since it was something like burning the bridge between them and civilization. They came back to camp, wonderfully, wonderfully refreshed and ravenous, and soon they had the campfire blazing up again. Huck had fuck, Huck found a spring of clear water close by, and the boys made a cup of hickory leaves and felt that water, sweetened by such a wildwood charm as that, would be good enough substitute for coffee. While Joe was slicing bacon for breakfast, Tom and Huck stepped to a nook in the riverbank and threw their lines. Joe had, Joe had not had time to get impatient before they were back again with some handsome bass, a couple of sunperch, and a small catfish. They fried the fish with the bacon, and no fish had ever seemed so delicious before. After breakfast, they went off through the woods on an exploring expedition. They tramped gaily along, over decaying logs, through underbrush, along solemn monarchs of the forest hung with a drooping regalia of grapevines. Now and then they came upon snug nooks carpeted with grass and jeweled with flowers. They found plenty of things to be delighted with, but nothing to be astonished at. They discovered that the island was about 3 miles long and a quarter mile wide, and that it was only separated from the eastern shore by a narrow channel hardly 200 yards wide. They took a swim about every hour, so that it was the middle of the afternoon when they got back to camp. Then they fared sumptuously upon cold ham and threw themselves down in the shade to talk. The talk soon began to drag. The solemnity that brooded in the woods and the sense of loneliness began to tell upon their spirits. They fell to thinking. A sort of undefined longing crept upon them. This took dim shape. Presently, it was budding homesickness. Even Finn, the red-handed, was even Finn, the red-handed, was dreaming of his doorstep and empty hogsheads. But they were all ashamed of their weakness, and none spoke his thought. For some time now, the boys had been duly conscious of a peculiar sound in the distance, just as one is sometimes of the ticking of a clock when he takes no distinct note of it. But now the sound became pronounced and forced recognition. The boys, startled, glanced at each other, and then assumed a listening attitude. There was a long silence, then a deep, sullen boom. "What is it?" exclaimed Joe under his breath. "I wonder," said Tom in a whisper. They waited a time that seemed an age, listening, and then the muffled boom troubled the solemn hush. "Let's go and see." They hurried to the shore towards the town, parted the bushes on the bank, and peered out over the water. A little steam ferry boat was about a mile below the village, drifting with the current. Her deck seemed crowded with people. There were also a great many skiffs rowing about or floating with the stream. Presently, a great jet of white smoke burst from the ferry boat's side, and as it expanded and rose in a lazy cloud, the same dull throb of sound was borne to the listeners again. I now know. I know. I know now, exclaimed Tom. Somebody's drowned. That's it, said Huck. They over that. They done that with Bill Turner got drowned. They shot up a cannon over the water and makes him come to the top. By James, I wish I was over there right now. I wish I was over there now, said Joe. I do too, said Huck. I give heaps to know who it is. The boys still listened and watched. Presently, a revealing thought flashed through Tom's mind, and he exclaimed, Boys, I know who's drowned. It's us. They felt like heroes in an instant. Here was a gorgeous triumph. They were missed. They were mourned. Tears were being shed, and best of all, the departed with the talk of the town and the envy of all the boys, as far as this dazzling notoriety was concerned. This was fine. This was worthwhile to be a pirate, after all. As twilight drew on, the ferry boat and skiffs disappeared. The pirates returned to camp, jubilant over their new grandeur. They caught fish, cooked supper, and ate it, and then fell to guessing at what the village was saying about them. But when the shadows of the night closed them in, they gradually ceased to talk and sat gazing into the fire, with their minds evidently wandering elsewhere. The excitement was gone now, and Tom and Joe could not keep back thoughts of certain persons at home who were not enjoying this fine frolic as much as they were. Misgivings came. A sigh or two escaped unawares. By and by, the night deepened. Huck began to nod, and presently to snore. Joe followed next. Tom lay with his elbow motionless for some time, watching the two. At last, he got up cautiously on his knees and went searching in the grass. He picked up and inspected several semi-cylinders of the thin white bark of sycamore, and finally chose two. Then he knelt by the fire and painfully wrote something upon each of these with his red keel. One he rolled up and put in his jacket. Ah, நான் குறிப்பேன். Ah, நான் record பண்றேன். வேணாந்து. இப்ப குறிக்கிறேன். He picked up and inspected several semi-cylinders of the thin white bark of sycamore, and finally chose two. Then he knelt by the fire and painfully wrote something upon each of these with his red keel. One he rolled up and put in his jacket pocket, and the other he put in Joe's hat. And then he also put into the hat certain schoolboy treasures of almost inestimable value: a lump of chalk, an India rubber ball, and 3 fish hooks. And then he tiptoed his way among the trees till he felt that he was out of hearing, and straightway broke into a run in the direction of the sandbar. A few minutes later, Tom was on the shoal water of the bar, wading through the Illinois shore. Before the depths reached his middle, he was over halfway over, and he struck out confidently to swim the remaining 100 yards. He swam quartering upstream, reached shore finally, and drew himself out. He put his hand on his jacket pocket and found his piece of bark safe, and then struck through the woods, following the shore. Shortly before 10 o'clock, he came out into the open place opposite the village and saw the ferry boat lying in the shadow of the high bank. Everything was quiet under the stars. He crept down the bank, watching with all his eyes, slipped into the water, and climbed into the skiff that was tied to the ferry boat's stern. He laid himself down under the thwarts and waited, panting. Presently the bell tapped, and a voice gave the order to cast off. A minute later, the skiff's head was standing high above the boat's swell, and the voyage was begun. Tom felt happy in his success, for he knew that the boat's last trip for the night. At the end of 15 minutes, the wheel stopped, and Tom slipped overboard and swam ashore, landing 50 yards downstream, out of danger of possible stragglers. He flew along unfrequented alleys, shortly found himself at his aunt's back fence. He climbed over, approached the sitting room window where a light was burning. There sat Aunt Polly, Sid, Mary, and Joe Harper's mother, talking. They were by the bed, and the bed was between them and the door. No, no, dear Mama. Thank you so much. And get into the microwave, Leo. But energy. God bless my grandmother. They were by the bed, and the bed was between them and the door. Tom went to the door and began to softly lift the latch. Then he pressed gently, and the door yielded a crack. He continued pushing, quaking every time it creaked, until he judged he might squeeze through on his knees. So he put his head through and began warily. "What makes the candle blow so?" said Aunt Polly. "Why, that door's open, I believe. Go and shut it, Sid." Tom disappeared under the bed just in time. He lay and breathed himself for a time, and crept to where he could almost touch his aunt's foot. "But as I was saying," said Aunt Polly, "he weren't bad, so to say, only mischievous. He weren't any more responsible than Colt. He never meant any harm. He was the best-hearted boy that ever was." And she began to cry. "It was just so with my Joe. Always up to every kind of mischief, but he was as unselfish and kind as he could be. And Laws bless me to think I went and whipped him for taking that cream, never once recollecting that I throwed it out myself because it was sour, and I never to see him in this world again. Never, never, never. Poor abused boy." And Mrs. Harper sobbed as if her heart would break. "I hope Tom's better off where he is," said Sid. "But if he'd been better in some ways." "Sid," said Aunt Polly, "not a word against my Tom now that he's gone. God'll take care of him. Never you trouble yourself, sir." "Oh, Mrs. Harper, I don't know how to give him up. He is such a comfort to me, although he tormented my old heart out of me most." At this, the old lady broke down entirely. Tom was now snuffling at himself, more in pity of himself than anyone else. He began to have a nobler opinion of himself than ever before, since he was sufficiently touched by his aunt's grief to long to rush out from under the bed and overwhelm her with joy. But he resisted. He went on listening, gathering by odds and ends that it was conjectured at as conjectured at first that the boys had got drowned while taking a swim, and then the small raft had been missed. Next, certain boys said that the missing lads had promised the village would hear something soon. And the wise heads had put this together and decided that the lads I've lost where I was. And decided that the lads had gone off on the raft that would turn up at the next town below. But toward noon, the raft had been found, lodged against the Missouri shore some 5 miles below the village. And then hope perished. They must be drowned, else hunger would have driven them home. It was believed that the drowning must have occurred in mid-channel, since the boys, being good swimmers, would have otherwise escaped to the shore. This was Wednesday night. If the bodies continued missing until Sunday, all hope would be given over, and their funerals would be preached on that morning. Tom shuddered. Mrs. Harper gave a sobbing good night and rose to go. The two women flung themselves into each other's arms and had a good, consoling cry, and then parted. Aunt Polly was tender far beyond her wont, and her good night and was Aunt Polly was tender far beyond her wont. In her good night to Sid and Mary. Tid snuffed a bit, and Mary went off, crying with all her heart. Aunt Polly knelt down and prayed for Tom, so touchingly, so appealingly, and with such measureless love in her words and her old trembling voice, that he was soon weltering in tears again. He had to keep still after she went to bed, for she kept tossing unrestfully. But at last she was quiet, only moaning a little in her sleep. Now the boy stole out, rose gradually by the bedside, shaded the candlelight with his hand, and stood regarding her. His heart was full of pity for her. He took out his sycamore scroll and placed it by the candle, but something occurred to him. He lingered considering. His face lighted with a happy resolution of his thought. He put the bark hastily in his pocket. Then he bent over and kissed the faded lips, and straightway made his stealthy exit. He threaded his way back to the ferry landing and walked boldly on board the boat, for he knew she was tenacious, except for the stern slipped into it, and was soon rowing cautiously upstream. When he had pulled a mile above the village, he started across. He hit the landing on the other side neatly, for this was a familiar bit of work for him to him. Then he stepped ashore, entered the wood, and into the wood. It was a broad daylight before he found himself fairly abreast the island bar. He plunged into the stream. A little later, he paused, tripping, upon the threshold of the camp. He heard Joe say, "No, Tom's true blue Huck. He won't desert. He's up to something. Now I wonder what. Well, the thing is ours anyway, aren't they? Pretty near, but not yet. The writing says they are, if he ain't back here to breakfast." "Which he is!" exclaimed Tom, with a fine dramatic effect, stepping grandly into the camp. A sumptuous breakfast of bacon and fish was shortly provided, and as the boys set to work upon it, Tom recounted and adorned his adventures. They were a vain, boastful company of heroes when the tale was done. Then Tom hid himself away in a shady nook to sleep. The other pirates got ready to fish and explore. You